want to go back to basics a little bit to start off with, because people might not be data experts in the room, and I'm not, frankly. We keep hearing about the word data, so can you give me some practical examples of what you collect and how people use it, and how I would notice it driving around or going on England's roads? So start with you, Tony, then, basically. What data are you actually collecting? How are you collecting it physically? And how are you using it now in a way that we'd all understand?
We have 30,000 plus devices, cameras, Midas loops, that how heavy the vehicle is, how fast it's going, whether it's stationary or not. We've got lots of data, and we consume that because we actually want to know what's going on our road network. We've got 7 regional control centers that monitor our network on a minute-by-minute basis. But we want people to drive safer. We want the behaviors of people to be influenced by the road conditions and the weather and so forth. So we take that data in. We take all the mobile data, the floating vehicle data that we talked about earlier. We fuse that together, and we present it back to the customer in saying, those signs that say it's 10 minutes in the next junction is accurate. It is 10 minutes in the next junction at 70 miles an hour. We're using that data to understand that can we improve the speed through roadworks? You know, should it be 55? Can it be 60? But we do that based on real metric data, so we actually understand what we're doing, and we do it in a safe way. So we're using it actively to improve the service we're offering the traveling public. That's what we use it for. But we also publish it for people who are designing our new road networks. So they can look at our data and say, well, how did that work? How many vehicles exit that junction, or are using this at certain times of the day? We make that data available to people. At the moment, we do it as a sort of a data drop. You can click on something, you can download it. Again, for me, that's a bit sort of clunky. I'd like it to be more interactive. So if we're putting roadworks out on, there was a crash up on the M62 this morning. That's going to be closed for a few hours. We want that to be dynamic. So the local authorities can pick that data up. Because at the moment, it's very, we talk to our local authorities, obviously. But I want that to be more data-driven, so it's intrinsic in the DNA of how we run our strategic road network.
It's interesting you pick up the point about something happens on a motorway and you use the data to sort out the traffic that's spilling off the motorway. Shane, didn't you have a point about the M6? That didn't happen.
Well, yeah, I mean, the West Midlands Police Commissioner had a report on the aftermath and the way the M6 crash, which I think was in early spring, was dealt with by the various local highway authorities. And I was quite critical of just the relationship, the data exchange and the protocols between the strategic network and the local highway authorities. And it's you know, as you sit on the sideline and you observe the relationship between the strategic network and the local highway authorities, it's an area of controversy. One doesn't really, as a neutral third party, want to get involved, but one knows, and everyone really admits, that the relationship and the cultural relationship could be vastly improved if, and Tony and I have talked about this, the protocols for sharing data, particularly around, for example, emergency diversion routes, you know, were shared more widely, and in a systems-to-systems way, it would do an awful lot to remove some of the friction around some of the relationships between. And I think the West Midlands Police Commission report just provided a little insight into how, at a practical level, our responses to emergency events and disruptions could be vastly improved by just removing the friction by which data can be shared between the different types of highway authorities.
Nick, you deal with a lot of councils. Does that ring a bell for you, basically?
Yes, of course. And in fact, I'll illustrate the point like this. My former boss, Steve Gooding, is in the audience here, now director of the RAC Foundation. He was the DG of Roads, Traffic and Local, as it was called in those days, in our department. And one of the many things that he inspired was the A14 project. One of the learnings from that project was that the blue light organizations are quite good at their own incident management. So the first person on the scene will arrive, and they've probably got devices they can get back to base with and that kind of thing. But the interoperability starts to fail at the headquarters level, where, in fact, to this day, and I had this confirmed at an iCentrum meeting of the West Midlands Fire Authority last night, the control rooms still get on the blower to each other to describe the incident to each other because of the lack of interoperability. And that perfectly illustrates the challenge with people being afraid that data might be subject to data protection. Well, of course, on a road accident, lots of data is subject to data protection. But the essence of what needs to be released is not being released in a timely fashion. And it results in terrible things happening because we don't know enough about the condition of the road or what the traffic conditions are. We found on the A14 project that 3 ambulances were being sent to one incident, not because the incident required 3 ambulances, but because the person, the dispatcher, didn't know which one would arrive first from the available data.
Crikey, yeah. I mean, does some of that come down to money? Like, you know, they've basically got to have the right computer systems in place, and we know that
Sure,
often doesn't happen at a local level.
That's why you can't solve it overnight.
And retraining people as well. You know.
Of course, but if you don't start to evangelize the fact that this is a problem that we should be trying to solve collectively, then things will go on in a siloed mentality. Because I think as human beings, we are quite tribal, so we tend to think in that way, and it's quite difficult to get people to think, actually, there's a greater good, there's a greater benefit here in opening things up.
Shane,
I would just deny that it's an issue of money. Even in these straitened times, if you look and you do FOIs and see what individual highway authorities and other organizations are actually spending, the problem is silo spending. I don't think it's truly an absence of money because compared to our infrastructural investment, the sorts of things that will make data flow are far less dimensional in terms of their investments. There are still large investments being made, but they're being made in pockets. And one of my great fears in terms of the way the industry is in you know, the direction it's going is we're in the business of creating subnational regional bodies. And actually, I see in their early stages some of the same silo thinking, the creation of systems and ecocultures for these subnational regional bodies. And I'm thinking, well, what's different between that and the Matisse project in the West Midlands 20 years ago, where again, you're thinking in a silo, it's just a bigger silo. It's interoperability being in the bloodstream of the thinking. I really deny that it's an issue in the macro sense of investment. This is small investment compared to the overall infrastructural investment.
Neil, your basically company is, well, I guess you're owned by the government effectively, but you're straddling the two sides because you're presumably looking to sell the information that you're gathering privately? How's it going to work for you for Ordnance Survey? What information are you gathering and what would you like to do with it?
So the information we're gathering in essence is a representation of the real world as we see defined into a set of use cases, whether it's land ownership, whether it's the utilities requirements, whether it's the highways requirements. So it's an attempt to say the real world's a complex place. We've got to try to capture that in some form so the data can be used meaningfully. And so, for example, on the roads project we've just completed, it's bringing together all the information that is out there, weights, widths, height restrictions, structure to the data, so there's a single view so that the local authorities and central government use the same structured data, same schema, so that the calculations can be the same. And that's a case of really putting our house in order now, so we've got a single clear view of the physical infrastructure. An Ordnance Survey provides that both through existing contracts within government, and that's freely shared across government, supplied as open data in some cases, and it's also supplied to the platform providers who license our data, and it makes its way into your smartphone. Now, what's interesting here, I think, is that about 5-6 years ago, we put out a major open data release, probably one of the biggest open data releases in mapping for any country in the world. And what happened with that release was twofold. One is it got subsumed immediately into the existing ecosystem. The platform providers took advantage of it. And it started to provide some interesting use cases that were sort of non-core. So people looking at solving specific problem sets they had. What subsequently happened is 5 years later, those platform organizations have come back and said, actually, we need much more than that. We need more complex data. We need it to be richer. We need it to be more current. And actually, we need very specific things. Actually, it's not just useful to know that's a 3-lane road. We actually need to know there's a fixed barrier here, or we need to know there's a traffic island there, or we need to know that there's drop curbs here, and there's a complex intersection of pedestrian and, and there's different surface types here. So, this is not just speed bumps, but, this is brickweave, which means that people feel naturally more willing to walk across brickweave than they do tarmac, but it actually isn't a zebra crossing. And so the demand for more data is not necessarily going to be met by the data we have now. So we need to collect this new data. And so, for example, you asked sort of what data do we need to collect? Well, some good examples there. The new highways data set make sure that you can navigate to the front door of somebody. And it might be that the formal road stops 100 yards up there and you're in a 1970s housing estate and there's a lot of sort of, you know, paths and tracks that people still need to navigate through. So the road networks become essentially a true network that literally leads to everybody's front door, regardless of whether it's road or whether it's path or whether it's, you know, an unadopted track or whatever. So that's a new requirement. But as I say, even more is now being asked. Every drop curb in the country, every street lamp, every manhole cover. I mean, these things sound incredibly ambitious, but there are demands creating for them. And now the technology allows us to capture that now. 5 years ago, it didn't.
How does the technology let you capture that then? How would you find out whether manhole covers
Well, luckily, and I say luckily, some of the new technology, the stuff that actually autonomous cars are using, autonomous vehicles, laser scanning systems, and very high-resolution imaging systems allow us to do texture analysis and pick up manhole covers. And the new sort of digital camera technology that we put in vehicles or we fly allow us to do that. I mean, for the Olympics, for example, we captured every manhole and anything you put your hand down, literally, you know, the thing you pop up and turn your stop car, for pretty much the whole of East London and all the sites. And a lot of that was done automatically. It's not cheap to do that, by the way, but it can be done. And so when you start saying, what new data do people want, it's almost limitless. I mean, in essence, they want the real world. They want, you know, if a vehicle is going to be measuring the real world with this technology, which it can do, you need to have something that represents the real world as well. And our maps and our data today is very, very linear, just worries about the highway casing or the pavement casing. It's very limited in its ambition in some respects, and it's very human-centric. You know, we like this data because we can recognize it as a road. If you really look at the way a vehicle or you know, let's take an autonomous vehicle sees the world, it's very differently. And you only have to look at their map of the world to realize how different it is to the maps we're used to using. And that's a huge challenge for all of us to deal with.
Because people have got used to Google Maps, haven't they? And going in and looking where their house is, and that's what people love. You know,
and if you look at I mean, even that is a fairly coarse product. You know, Google Maps is really only suitable for personal navigation. If you look at what a machine needs, it's an order of magnitude 10 times more accurate, 10 times more, probably 100 to 1,000 times more detailed.
Let's get TomTom's perspective on this, because obviously it is different. You're gathering data in a different way, for example, to Highways England. Tell us, how do you get it, and how are you then, you talked about bringing the customer in, the consumer voice. How do you do that? How are you helping people who are driving around?
Yeah, the two things are connected. I mean, I would agree entirely with what Neil said there, but there is no limit to how much data we can collect to understand and to develop a representation of reality. But there's a real question about why or whether that's required and how we do that. There's always a trade-off between coverage and detail, level of detail. And by coverage, I mean physical coverage of the physical infrastructure. So clearly there has to be a really good case to be made to go and collect manhole covers, surfaces versus the simple geometries suitable for driving and navigation. So that brings me to TomTom, because of course TomTom has been in the map-making business for 20 years, now covers well over 250 countries. We have maps which are used for navigation applications and of course navigation within vehicles. And again, at this stage, maps are relatively crude things. They don't need all that detail. You don't need that detail to route to a destination. But increasingly, of course, there are demands to provide multimodal transit options, urban transit options, safe routes through cities. And all of these things are features and require additional features and additional attributes to be captured from the real world, using LiDAR, using laser scanning techniques, and also field workers, field survey, rather than purely the equivalent of a Google car, a TomTom car, or an Ordnance Survey mobile mapping van. TomTom, separately from map making, I guess, it uses, although it's again connected, we collect masses and masses of GPS probe data, we call it. To give you a sense of how big GPS data is, there are well over 1.5 million users or drivers out there on the road providing us with data every day. If we were to calculate the total driven distance, every 5 seconds it would cover the circumference of the Earth. Every 5 seconds we're collecting the equivalent driven distance around the Earth, and it would take us just 9 days to reach Mars and back. So it's a huge amount of information, and we use that not only to develop and inform the map and the geometries that you discussed a moment ago, but also to provide and license transport data, so historic traffic information data, congestion information, and speed data. And again, that's where Highways England come in. That's a hugely valuable resource, but it has to be recognized as a capital asset. It's something that once you've collected, you have to make open as a public organization, but it has to be recognized as a capital investment. It's something that is useful, not just in the moment, now, for a road traffic officer, a network manager to use now, but it's something that they want to be able to use in 3 months, 3 years, 30 years' time, to understand how well the organization is responding to incidents on the network.
So, sorry, did I read that right? You're basically saying you want their data to be open. Does that mean free? So companies like TomTom
it's purely a recognition that as a public authority, and as Nick mentioned earlier, the open data strategy requires any data collected in the public interest to deliver public services has to be made open, and that seems entirely fair and appropriate.
And that's what we're doing. I think, taking what Neil said, I mean, if you wanted to drill down and you wanted to see the quality of the asset, the gantry, everything else, we got that data. Why can't you use it? Okay, that's my answer is, I don't see any impediment, apart from the fact is that they're within my organisation, as I have, there's still silos within the silos. So it's my job to actually bring that data integration back and publish it. The interesting thing about whether it's costed or not, it is open by default, open data by default. That's what we do, but it's on request rather than by default. And I think I'd like to see highways, when someone wants to subscribe to data, they can just get the data. If there's a value to that data because the organisation that is asking for it is using it for commercial gain, then there's a discussion to have, is there a commercial opportunity there to reduce the cost to the taxpayer? But that's not where we are. We're open by default and we've got that. But I think it's quite interesting when you drill down into your maps, it'd be interesting to actually see the latest gantry or the latest VMS sign. I think that would be useful. We have that information, and there's no reason why we don't publish it.
It's interesting, you mentioned that. We do. We take the VMS gantry locations, and the next stage in that process of data fusion, data integration, is actually displaying what's on the VMS signs, the vehicle messaging signs, in vehicle. That's got to be the next obvious step, and more automakers are demanding that as well. And so we're going through a process of working with Highways England, in fact, to look at how to best do that safely, to inform the driver safely. So, great example, really, of open data becoming something that is used as just like Ordnance Survey open data, it's used by people in ways which we cannot imagine right now.
Okay, I want to throw it open now to people who've come along for questions. Does anyone have a question? If you put your hand up, we can get a microphone to you. If there's no, at the front here, and then we'll come to you afterwards, if that's all right. So if we can get a microphone to this chap. Is he one of yours?
I think there's one. No, he's not a plant. He's definitely, this man is definitely not a plant.
But we do recognise it.
Oh, okay.
Hi, hello, Steve Hilditch from Tallers. I've got a question for you. We've said that there is a sort of struggle for the ownership of personal data between the Californians and perhaps the government on the other side. Will that war ever cease? Will there be peace? Will one side win and the other go away crying? What will happen?
I very much hope there will not be outright war. I think that gradually, the market for data is in a very, very immature state. And it just so happens that because of the history of the World Wide Web in particular, as being one of the most popular applications on the internet, that we are used to consuming information, data, etc., free at the point of use. However, of course, behind the scenes, there is a sort of Faustian pact that we provide data, mostly to these Californian companies. Unlike in the software industry, which I'm used to working in, what people really do not realize is when we provide our data to a certain search engine, the ownership of that data changes at the point when they absorb it. You try and get the data out of them, that's a lot more difficult than giving them the data. Giving them the data is fine, because we are actually the product. As we navigate around using these so-called free mapping services, we are actually the product. And what we are giving away is knowledge of where we're going, and from that, they can sell us back location services through their advertising model. That's how it all works. That is not a healthy way for the world to proceed, really. But of course, everyone, I'm not against the idea of the creation of data being paid for. Neil's organization deserves to be paid for the incredibly highly skilled costs involved in creating that data. The challenge is, how should it be paid for, not whether it should be paid for. And I think at the moment in the public sector, we're quite ambivalent on this subject. Whereas if you look at open source software, it's a very mature market. And when software is created as open source, it remains open source. That's the deal with the license. And therefore, wherever it's passed on to, and whoever adds value to it, the original thing has to remain open. That's not true with data, unfortunately. I think that's the thing we've got to change.
Neil, you have a point.
Yeah, actually, I shouldn't really do a pitch, but there's a great book called Who Owns the Future by a guy called Jared Lanier, who's one of the sort of technology advocates in the States, West Coast. It's a brilliant book about that exact question. I'll definitely read it. After reading it, you start to feel very uncomfortable and start switching off a lot of the options on your mobile phone when you read out what's actually being done. But the point about how you pay, how you invest in data is critical here. Contextually, a large program of improving quality of data in the urban areas for us would cost, say, 60 to 70 million pounds. Yeah? That's, in essence, what a big resurvey program for the cities would cost at the detail we do it. So we've got an option. We can either go to government as our shareholder and say, we want 50 to 60 million pounds, please, so that we can resurvey these parts of the country, because there's a government demand, but there's actually also a commercial demand. And quite rightly, they go, ooh, that's a lot of money. So we need to try to find different models, because clearly releasing some of this data is absolutely in the interest of an open ecosystem. But clearly, should government pay the full burden of cost of capture when, in fact, it's being used very widely by the big sort of utilities or the big platform providers? And I don't think it's a binary answer, actually. I think with bright people, we can usually work out a good outcome, and we can usually solve that problem. But it still comes back to the point that the investment we need to make in capturing data, if data is the new oil, and by the way, if it's the new oil, then somebody probably was going to tax it at some point. But if data is the new oil, it's got to be significantly invested in. And that isn't happening yet.
No.
And it's not a small investment. You know, we can have the great conversation that says, oh, you know, you put data out and 1,000 flowers will bloom. Brilliant. But that's the data we have. And actually, most of that's written off in cost. And so you can release it. It's the data you need we haven't costed the capture of yet. And it's going to be hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds worth of investment on our data infrastructure. And I don't mean here the sort of the physical infrastructure of connecting our clouds to each other. I mean the core capture. Now that is, to a certain degree, managed now by a mixed ecosystem. So TomTom will capture data, and they'll license it to Apple and Google and here and the utilities, and, well, not here, sorry, but the utilities and all the other companies. We'll capture data, and we'll license it to similar organizations. And so you do have a mixed model. One single model, I think, could be quite difficult for us, because ultimately you'd be asking for big investment funds into government, the same with its local authorities. So we need to find a much more sort of sophisticated way of creating that healthy data marketplace, which is starting to be built at the moment, but still very slowly and very incrementally.
I think,
Right.
sorry,
Sorry,
just to
yeah,
add to that,
sorry, no,
just,
carry on.
picking up on Nick's point again as well, that we really need to make that business case very clearly for the collection of data, because unlike oil, data is limitless. There's no limit to how much we could collect. It's just, why do we need it? Can we use it if we do collect it? And I don't think that case has been made clearly yet within the department, within Highways England as well, that, you know, albeit we can collect it, but actually you may already have a lot of this information. Things like asset management registers or asset registers in the past would collect, you know, location of signposts or lampposts, every possible barrier on the road network. Are we asking a mapping agency like Ordnance Survey to go out and collect that all over again, or could we use that source and simply update it and maintain it? There are lots of options, but we have to make that case very clear as to why we're collecting it.
Yeah, and I'd like to add one more thing. I mean, having previously worked on HS2, and we did a massive LiDAR scanning of how it's going to affect the countryside and cities, and we've got the same in highways. And we've got we're talking about BIM and clash detection. Yeah. This is clash detection on an infrastructure scale. Why are we not reusing that LiDAR data? And there is absolutely no reason. It's the fact that they're still not silos, but they're actually like-minded. The DFT is actually quite advanced when it thinks about data. But we need to unleash that. We need to sort of say, come on guys, let's not do this. Because that is still costing both organisations a vast sum of money to record and to store.
Mobile mapping vans driving around Great Britain at the moment, whether they're for a local authority, highways agencies, platform providers, or organisations, we put all that together. What would we actually have? Probably quite a useful asset.
Are people doubling up a lot in what they're collecting at the moment? Is there people collecting the same thing but not telling each other?
There's a lot of duplication, yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Okay, we had a question here from a lady.
Steve.
Yeah. Hi, thanks very much. You've actually kind of answered my question in that conversation. Teresa Jolly, DEFT 153. My question really was originally coming back to Neil's point about the fact that you recognised from opening up the data about 5 years ago that you realise now a lot more is needed and a lot more detail. And you were listing some examples there of curbs and streetlights and the detail out on the highways asset. Tony's already come to this from a Highways England perspective. My plea is from a local authority perspective, which is, as you guys have just said, this data exists in a format that's been used for asset management and maintenance purposes for quite a while. The local highways authorities are being encouraged by DFT through the Highways Maintenance Efficiency Programme to use their existing data in more effective ways to manage their network, not only for their own prioritisation of highways maintenance with the limited funds. And again, Nick mentioned that the funding gets thrown into a lot of other areas, and that there is this real crisis still with the funding available for local highways authorities, asset management and maintenance. The use of data to find and encourage funding in to provide the kind of backdrop to make those maintenance activities work is one thing, and HMEP is encouraging that. But actually, for the journey planning and the data, really interesting point about the data being used not only for visual maps for people, but also to connect within different things as well. That data exists. You guys have all mentioned it. It's about the silos. We don't really need to go out and collect it all again. We need to find a way to use that data. We may still need to add bits into it, but it exists, and we need to find a way to bring that together in a collaborative format and absolutely answer this question. I can see Highways England here. We've mentioned a few bits about highways, local highways authorities and that integration. Very useful point, Shane, about the West Mids response, the Police Commissioner's response to that. We have 153 local authorities in England alone. We need to find a way to make this work.
So picking up on that and joining it to Shane's point, I think that we've heard that the data exists. We've heard that we cannot take a case to local authorities for saying, open up your data for the greater good, because there are big, big funding challenges in local authorities right now. But we can take a case to local authorities that says, if you use the new tools that are available, then you go to an open source model and you embrace cloud hosting to increase interoperability, you can actually save money, give more funding to things like adult social care, And that's really the strong message. And I guess there's a fair number of people in this room from industry who probably have in their organization, you know, hosting of individual siloed data for highways maintenance and so forth. It's how we open that up that will, you know, unblock society, enable us to make better decisions about travel, enable us to make better decisions about maintenance. That's why it's important.
Shane, I'll put you on the spot. I'll give you the last. Is there one obvious way to open it up to get it? Does the government have to get involved and start dictating? Does that even work? I mean, or is it just unrealistic?
I sat with Neil on a number of sort of advisory panels, and we've all mercifully been disbanded in the latest bonfire of the Quangos. But one of the ones I sat on was the local data panel. And actually, we came up with some really quite useful outputs. And one of them, it addresses Teresa's point, just thinking, Teresa, let me put this, not 1,000 miles away from you is a major metropolitan authority who signed a PFI with a supplier under certain contractual arrangements, which makes it very, very difficult to access even basic streetworks information without huge costs, friction, etc. And one of the things before we were consumed in the bonfire of the Quangos, one of the really good outputs was to try and urge local authorities to look at the sort of contractual templates around IP, because, you know, I talked about a 10 to 25 year purview. Change comes dropping very slowly in this industry. There are embedded contracts, and because of the time frame, there are legacy systems. It can be extremely costly, huge amount of friction just to release from existing systems. And I think a long-term push from central government to actually just really look at the IP clauses in our supplier contracts would, over a period of time, one of the practical ways of trying to release data. We've been in the business of trying to release local authority data for a long time. And one thing we've also learned that you have to, no one in a local authority, because they haven't got time, does things for the national benefits. That's government's job. Yeah. You have to provide a local incentive for them to release data. And there's one thing about that, it keeps their skin in the game. They're doing it for their own reasons, and that actually helps to the sustainability of the model. But I think it's a long-term game, Teresa, but I think you have to look sympathetically on the fact that these are very long-term contracts. They're with suppliers. It's wrapped around technology, which everyone in senior management runs away from. So we hand the keys of the asylum to the IT guys, and the IT guys are interested in their systems, and suppliers, not unnaturally, are responsible to the shareholders. If we can get that idea into our head that data needs to be released and separated, so you can always get access to the data without necessarily coming hand in hand with the supplier's tools.
So, if I may, just one thing. One of the things I've seen in highways, we've got some major programs to actually consolidate our control rooms and put some smarter tech in there. One thing Highways England did on its formation is create a technical directorate, which I head up. That's traffic technology and the core tech. So, yeah, I'm a bit mad sometimes, but you know, I think it's right. But what I have done is I've changed the contract conditions of some of those things. So, one of my commercial guys had an IPR clause saying the IPR resides within the supplier. Absolutely not. We are not going to give the crown jewels away. So we've changed that clause, and we've said you have to demonstrate that you take an open data seriously, use all the standard things that we say in government, and in there, the IPR resides with highways. And if you want to share that, if it's not pre-existing, obviously, but if you want to share that, let's have a commercial discussion. We need to be smarter, and I think we are getting smarter.
Great. Final word, yeah.
I think there's also one sort of, I mean, we passed this, but I think it's also important to recognize that just having the data isn't the solution either. If you look at the classic problem of a truck getting stuck under a bridge, or even more tragic ones, ambulance not finding a property, it's not because the data's not somewhere, it's because the data's not where it needs to be. Mm-hmm. And so, tragically, there's been many a case where an emergency service hasn't updated their in-vehicle data holding, their command and control center hasn't updated, and often it comes down to simple points like it costs them money to update They've got a service contract with a system integrator, and it costs them £25,000 to do an A2 update. So even though the data is maybe available every 2 or 3 weeks, they maybe only update it once a year. I'm as guilty. You know, I've had a sat-nav in my car for 3 years, and I haven't updated it. Why? Because when I go to the dealer, he wants to charge me 90 quid. So I live with the fact that where I live, you know, the A11 bypass around Thetford isn't on there. You know, it could be. So there's a whole issue here about the supply chain in the ecosystem. I mean, TomTom has said they've had bridge heights forever. So why are HGV goods drivers still hitting bridges? You know, and the answer is because either they're not using the device or they've not updated it. So even when you do have the data, there's a whole host of education, and whether that needs to be mandated or not, I honestly don't know, but you begin to wonder whether you do need to start to have some level of control, because you can still have all the data you think you need, but if the decision isn't being taken at the point of criticality, i.e. the driver of a HGV or in the ambulance, you haven't actually, in that specific use case, solved the problem.
And autonomous vehicles actually help on that, because they can tell us. I mean, the autonomous vehicles can say, you can't go down that road, it's too thin, it's too low. We've got the technology now, to be fair. We just need to enable it.
It's a fascinating conversation. We could go on, I think, but we have run out of time. I need to do a bit of housekeeping, let you know about a few things. I need to thank Fleur, who's the sponsor of this interesting session. You can see there's a lot of people here, day 2 of a conference, there's a lot of interest. You can see just by the size of the people that have come here. A huge amount happening on the size of the audience rather, they're all big. There's a huge amount happening on the exhibition floor over in the lunch period. On the Burgess Salmon stage, we've got a keynote conversation at 12:50. That explores the interrelationships between roads investment, devolution, economic development. This is followed by Colin Matthews, Chair of Highways England, at 1:30. Don't forget the Reece Jeffreys Road Fund reception in the speaker lounge. That's another fascinating idea we were talking about earlier, just outside this theatre, talking about the major roads network. So please thank our panellists. A really interesting conversation. Thank you.